sorry, but I was like, no, he's
No, you know, the ghost of Courtney wasn't here. Where's Courtney? You know, it's funny. I used to tease old people when I was young. And like now I feel like I need to go to all the old people I tease and be like, no, I get it, man. You just forget stuff. And you just forget stuff, you know? All right. I think we're going with the video. I've admitted. Yep. All right. So thank you, Kiara. I think we have to understand that the goal here for interest groups is to really pursue that one interest that they think is more important to their perspective or their political interests than anything else. So everything from the NAACP to Human Rights Watch to Greenpeace, these are all examples of interest groups because again, all the members of those groups are focused on a single issue. It doesn't mean they don't have interest in other political areas. It just means for that group, they want to focus their efforts on that issue. Any questions so far on the definition of an interest group? Okay, so again, kind of like a political party, they want to bring together, they want to collaborate and cooperate. Basically, they want to combine their political strength to accomplish the one goal. And so, I mean, there are interest groups basically on every issue in American politics. That's as simply as I could put it. And you know what? If anybody can think of an issue where there's not already an interest group, I'm all ears because I've tried. Is this making sense so far? Are you guys tracking? I mean, I like can't express enough how important there are interest groups for businesses. Walmart is part of multiple interest groups, whether it's for industry and business or trade and taxes or the presidential group on economic development. These are sorts of things. They're essentially interest groups. And the question becomes, well, how much are they influencing American politics? How do they have more power than they should? And if so, what do we do about it? And so the question is, again, what exactly are they doing in American politics that's giving them this influence? So, first and foremost, one of the things an interest group does to promote its particular issue is to choose to support a particular candidate. So that's the first way. Now, what's important to understand is the relational component here. All right, I'm trying to the NRA. Is anybody familiar with the NRA, National Rifle Association? Okay. When you run for office, the NRA has a grade sheet for every politician in America, and they give you an F to an A plus, depending on what they believe to be your commitment to protecting Second Amendment rights. Is everybody with me? The NRA has millions of members. If you want to get elected in a state like Texas, you better get an A plus grade from the NRA. That is extremely powerful politically. It's the same thing as if you started a business and the local chamber of commerce gave you a AAA business rating. That's gold. You're going to put that on every marketing piece. You're going to do everything you can to let your customers know that these people who run all the businesses in the community have said that I'm one of the best businesses. That's the same exact thing for interest groups when it comes to politics. And in fact, the Chamber of Commerce is an interest group. I mean, that's how muddied this can be. That's how you could literally be the member of an interest group, two different interest groups that kind of work against each other at times. You could be the member of an LGBTQ plus kind of community organization thing and be Republican or be conservative or be part of a religious group. You don't have to have, there doesn't have to be a synchronicity between your interests because you can choose which interest group you want to be. Is this making sense so far? Questions? Any questions? All right. Another way that these groups can influence and impact American politics, it's not just that they support candidates, give them plus grades or minus grades. These groups have members. And anyone that's ever been part of a community group, an interest group, a church, one of the primary strengths of organization is simply having bodies to do stuff. People who are willing to volunteer, help build the house for how Habitat for Humanity, help with soup kitchens on Thanksgiving. That's an important part of how interest groups, and I would argue how our communities tend to operate. Interest groups in particular, they're not just bringing together a large group of people. All the people in that group have already expressed their commitment to that issue. So they'll volunteer for that candidate who's got the A+ NRA rating. And what does that mean? They'll go door to door. They'll campaign for them. They'll answer the phones. They'll get donations. They'll give donations. So although the group itself is not political, they have an enormous amount of influence and ability to support political actors. That's one of their primary strengths of power. Questions so far? Any questions?
Is this where lobbying comes into play?
Yes, we're going to get to that, because that's, so I guess if you're talking about kind of like levels of influence, okay, so I start my own little organization. I want to protect rare coral in garages. That's going to be my special interest, man. I'm going to fight for people that have aquariums in their garages. That's my interest. Well, early on, the best I'm going to be able to do is hopefully just get some information out there, make people aware that, well, people with aquariums in their garages are being discriminated against, and we got to do something. So information, kind of the first level. But then all of a sudden, Sarah, Crystal, and Selena are like, man, you know what? That's wrong. I'm going to join that group and I'm going to help them fight that. So now all of a sudden I'm collecting people. So now that power of the group is the next level, if you will. I can volunteer. People are starting to take notice. Lobbying is when I actually have money to back up my pursuit of the interest. Now I can start giving you something. Hey, Mr. Candidate, it's one thing for me to give you a couple of volunteers for your phones, but what if I offered you a $25,000 donation to help your campaign? Now all of a sudden he's like, you know what? Discrimination against aquarium owners is terrible. I'm going to be right in your corner. Now I'm getting somewhere. So to make the point, right? One of the greatest impacts of interest groups is they really fill that gap between the understanding of politicians as to what the problems are they're supposed to be addressing and how those problems are manifesting and then communicated within the community. So when you think of excuse me, a special interest group influencing politics and politicians, here's a great example for you to remember. Black Lives Matter. Perfect example of an interest group. So for instance, Black Lives Matter has never gotten close to the idea or the level where they're going to actually start lobbying. They don't necessarily have that high level infrastructure. They sure as heck aren't getting the high level of donations and things like that. But they have that group, and that group creates a certain level of power behind the message. And now public officials are persuaded to take action because of that. So that's influence is a really important part of those early stages and mid stages of public interest groups. Questions so far?
Dr. Watson?
Yes, ma'am.
Is the National Rifle Association responsible for, I think at some point they were talking about arming teachers after a shooting in a school?
Well, that was something that they promoted. It's very interesting. The history of the NRA is actually quite fascinating. It transformed in many ways. A lot of people don't understand or don't know, for instance, that the real original purpose of the NRA was to promote, and you're going to laugh when I say this, it was to promote hunting in conjunction with sound environmental practice and maintaining animal populations. The primary goal of the National Rifle Association in the 1920s and 30s was to kind of meld this idea of because remember, we're still talking about the quote unquote open West. And so it was very much an environmental kind of know how to handle your rifle as part of your engagement with the great natural divide of America. It's only into the 1950s and 1960s with the agitation of the civil rights movement and also the anti-war movement that the NRA starts to get a little bit more aggressive in its promotion of Second Amendment rights as its primary focus as an organization. And that really comes to the forefront during the 1980s and the rise of general gun violence in America. But the NRA, so the NAACP, I just learned the other day, 2/3 of the people that started the NAACP were white. Never knew that. It's just an amazing part of the history of that organization that I personally never would have thought of, especially when you consider some of the recent discussions the NAACP leadership when it was found out that one of the individuals that was part of the group that said she was black actually wasn't. Anybody know this story? Yeah, that was
Rachel.
Yes. And she was like super activist. She was a leader in the Western NAACP across the Western United States. And it turned out that she just kind of called herself black, but she wasn't actually black. And it was this huge issue within the organization as to what do we do? She basically lied about being black. And what's fascinating about that is the idea that you can lie about being black. No one even got into that. The idea of biraciality in this country is such a weird dynamic that I don't think we fully understood how it fits into. Anyway, why am I getting caught up in this? Sorry, guys. Did I mention I'm a professor who likes to talk? Okay. History of interest groups. All right. Interest groups predate political parties in America. Let me say that again. Interest groups existed in America before political parties, and in fact, before there was an America. I guess if you want to be as basic as you can be, interest groups exist in every society in the world throughout all human history. Right down to people sitting outside the caves, and there's an interest group that wants to go hunting and an interest group that doesn't. And they argue back and forth over what they're going to do as a group. That's politics. And the moment you have groups within that political system that are focused on a specific issue, you have an interest group. And so you have to argue there were interest groups for and against independence before the Constitution. So I just want you to get thinking about this idea. The interest group is a very general, it's almost like trying to explain what a cloud is. I can see it, but I'm not going to be able to pick it up and hold it out because it has so many different forms that it almost has no particular form. But you know when it's there. Does this make sense? Or am I confusing the heck out of you? Because again, I mean, on the one end, the NRA, man, they are a titan of interest groups, except for maybe interest groups formed by major corporations. So there's an interest group of which Google, Amazon, Facebook, they're all members, and they use that interest group for social media industry. And they make sure they go and they lobby and they, influence politicians. They got millions of dollars to donate, On a whole other end, you've got like your local Save the River kind of group. That's an interest group too. So it's just understanding that you can be an enormous interest group. You could be 4 guys who just, put out a little digital newsletter. That's an interest group too. So by the 1830s and 1840s, interest groups in the United States really start to coalesce around this idea of slavery versus anti-slavery, or what we come to know as the abolitionists. And another really interesting part of the early development of interest groups is regardless of what side of a topic you were on, say anything from slavery to economics to settling the West to the question of what to do with Native American Indian populations, there was a deep ingraining of religious associations in those groups. So let me put this another way. As much as we understand religious freedoms in this country, and they are one of our great freedoms without a doubt, you also understand how much deeper religious identity was as part of America in the early part of our existence. Everybody was religious. Now, it didn't mean that we didn't have different, some people went to church more regularly than others, but everyone, even if you didn't know what it fully meant, everyone had what they believed to be a religious identity. Why is that important? Because churches much as today, are one of the primary originations of the interest group. I'll put it even more direct. The expansion and differentiation of churches in America is people within that religious group saying, this particular thing is not serving this particular interest. I want a different type of service. I want my group to allow gay and lesbian ministers, whatever it is. And all of a sudden you take that special interest, you create your own group. So this is a really important part of our American identity. This idea that if me and Selena just believe enough in something, we can start our own group, we can put up a web page, we can advertise. What do you know? We get Sarah and Alita to join. We've got a group of people interested in this thing. That is a real American concept. Questions so far? Wow. All right. Oh, go, Selena, go.
Okay, so maybe I'm backtracking a little bit here, but can you kind of like re-clarify or elaborate the difference between a special interest group and interest group in general? Like I'm kind of
Same thing.
just thinking.
Same exact thing. The only reason, so let me put this, there are, much like many of the other things we deal with in our society, if you're in power, if you have a predominant amount of power as a male, as someone who's rich, interest groups become a threat because they almost are always trying to point out things that are failing or unfair or simply need to be recognized within the system. So for instance, you're not going to get too many white superiority or white nationalist interest groups within the main political sphere. They still exist. We call one of them the KKK. That is a political interest group in this country, unfortunately. Okay. That said, the far majority of interest groups are for individuals who desperately want their perspectives to be included in the broader political narrative. So you'll see there, one of the shifts that you see in the development of American interest groups over time is as the American economy begins to grow, one of the groups that feels most left out is the worker. So where the church was the foundation of interest groups, maybe for the first 100 years or so of the country, labor starts to become the primary source of interest groups in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It's the development of unions, farmers organizations. And then what do you get? The businesses go, fine, we're going to create our own interest groups too. And so you have a telecommunications interest group. You have the National Transportation Society. I mean, everybody forms interest groups. Why? Because why should I give my $100 donation to the Democratic Party, who's then got to cover the environment, women's rights, gay rights, racial discrimination, fixing the government. I mean, I can go on and on, all the different stuff that the Democratic Party is involved in. Or do I give my $100 to Greenpeace? Because then every dollar is going just to the environment. Go ahead, Kiara.
So would the NRA be lobbyists too, since you said they're one of the big?
Yes, they are probably the single largest, most powerful lobbying organization in the United States. And I say that, I need to be clear. The business world has enormous lobbying power. Okay. Like the thing, you want to know a business group that just truly has enormous influence over American politics? The Soybean and Corn Growers Union. Enormous. I'm talking enormous power on the American economy. When you think of the number of things that we use soybeans and corn for, just those two things, and how much of it we produce, how much of it we transport to every corner of the country, let alone international trade. When somebody in a soybean thing says, hey, we need to do this, guess what? They're at the front of the line. And they're just a specialist group, just like everybody else. Go ahead, Kiara.
I'm got to lower my hand.
Oh, okay. So the first era. Yeah, go ahead.
So when you put on the history of interest group 1770, that means you're talking about the anti-federalists and the federalists as different interest groups.
Who had different interest groups? I didn't catch that last part.
I said, when you put 1770 as a part of the history of interest group, does it mean you consider anti-federalists and federalists as different interest groups?
Absolutely. Absolutely. No doubt. They didn't have the same organization that we see in these groups today, obviously, right? They didn't have the internet. They didn't have, hell, they couldn't even necessarily quickly talk to each other in Philadelphia versus New York. But that cooperative effort by a group of people for one single interest that they share, that's the fundamental definition of an interest group. Slave owners, that was an interest group. Abolitionists, that was an interest group. The women's rights organizations of the 1910, 1920s, those were interest groups. All of them. So again, I mean, it's about, it sounds like it's almost like, well, if everything's an interest group, then nothing is, you know, one of those kind of comments. But again, the key here is you're not just sitting in your backyard with a bunch of friends talking about, wouldn't it be great if? You're actually trying to then impact the political system. That's what makes you an interest group. Does that make sense? I mean, quite literally. So
What was the
love
last
poker.
part? What'd you just say? My daughter's talking to me. Sorry.
No, no problem. It's just understanding that just because you're sitting around talking about a special interest that you all share, that doesn't make you an interest group. You actually then have to go out and try and change something, try and affect the political system in relation to that interest you have. So I had a bunch of buddies a long time ago. I love a good poker game, and we had a nightly poker game at my buddy's house and watched a football game, so on and so on. He decided he was going to agitate against the laws that banned poker, and online poker specifically, because he thought that, well, there was a variety of different reasons. The second he started putting names on a list and then created this website, and he started talking to it was actually the local representative on what he would have to do to get it to the state level. The moment he started that, he moved from just being a concerned citizen to the head of an interest group. It's that connection to the political system. And the first period in which this really starts to take place is 1900 to 1920. And the primary reason why this is the first great era of interest group expansion, I'll say it again, 1900 to 1920, the first era of interest group expansion. The reason why we're talking, so just on average, let's say there's 10 new interest groups per month. During this period, we're talking about hundreds of new interest groups per month. Part of the reason why was this massive expansion of the economy, and you have to understand, and if anybody's ever studied America during what's called the Gilded Age, 1900 to 1920, you might have heard the term the Roaring 20s. Economic expansion in America from about 1890 to 1920, it was all brakes were off. I mean, the level of expansion and growth was unprecedented in modern human history. Maybe England in the early part of the Industrial Revolution came close, but that was about it. The problem was that the American government did not have either the power or the laws in place to really regulate that growth. And so the level of exploitation was just through the roof. You want to see just horrible pictures? Look at like the development of the oil industry in Western Pennsylvania during the 1920s. They stripped every tree. There's no grass. It is just miles and miles of oil derricks, you know? And I mean, that was just one instance. I mean, so you get all these environmental groups, you get all these labor groups, you get all these business groups. It's a real explosion of the interest group concept. Now, I'm hoping that you all can immediately figure out why 1960 to 1980 is the second great era of interest group expansion, he said with hopeful enthusiasm. Why do you think 1960 to 1980 would be the second era? What was going on?
The Great Depression?
No, Great Depression's 1920s, 1930s.
Wasn't it one of the wars?
Which war?
Vietnam?
Vietnam? Ding ding. Point one. I would argue there's an even bigger issue going on in the 1960s in America. What's going on? Civil rights movement. Everybody and their mother is trying to agitate for their rights. Women, hippies, communists, the silent majority. I could go on and on. But we're talking about a period in time when individual Americans discovered that if you didn't like what your party was doing, you could form a special interest group. And it's not just there were hundreds of national student associations. Some were focused on anti-war, some were focused on education, but all of a sudden, if you were a student, you had kids forming their own political institutions and organizations and trying to agitate for everything from environmental changes to, empowering the Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts. I mean, the development of special associations and special interest groups is driven at a faster and farther rate during 1960s, and especially in the 1960s and 1970s. Gay rights groups, women's rights groups, the rise of the Native American issue. I was growing up, this is going to sound really goofy. There was a commercial where they had a Native American gentleman, and it was supposed to be about the environment. And basically, he's just a Native American. You just see a tear roll down his eye. And it's like, it was supposed to be a Native American expression of sorrow over what was happening to the American environment. Does this strike a bell with anybody? It was like a really famous commercial at the time. Anyway, it was one of the first times you saw this connection between the Native American culture and population and the idea of American environmentalism. And so those were all these different messages that were being developed at the time. And it was almost as if each message came with its own interest group. Questions so far? All right. So we know what an interest group is, and we started talking about what it does. So here's a key question. What makes a successful interest group? Because again, here's the truth of it, and I hope he's not listening, but my buddy in the poker thing fell flat on his face. He had like 7 guys, and they went out with like a sign outside the Capitol once. And that was like the whole sum total of the movement. Was not successful. Okay. So what determines success versus not success? First, determination, leadership. Not just any leadership, but a leadership that can literally market the interest. So it might be a leader that's famous or has personality. It might be a leadership that's willing to take risks and really go out there. But in the end, leadership is a key component to the success of special interest groups. Is anybody familiar with Black Lives Matter as an organization? You are. Okay. One of the things that is really hindering its ability to be a successful interest group is significant division within its leadership. If anybody's aware, there's one group that wants to make Black Lives Matter almost like an NRA, a highly functioning, very polished, get the Black Lives Matter movement to the point where they're starting to lobby like other organizations, suit and tie, let's go to the Capitol, boom, boom, boom. But there's a whole nother piece of Black Lives Matter leadership that says that is not where we came from. We are a grassroots, jeans and shirt, go. Oh no. Can you guys also see me? Everything's still good?
I see you.
Yeah.
Oh, I just got a notification that I got signed out. So, wow, that's weird. All right. So, the other end of the Black Lives Matter leadership actually wants the organization to remain very grassroots, very, very original and community based, right? And so it's not about a single national structure. It's more about a collection of community groups that work together and develop protests. So there's really division. Let me put it another way. I think that that's part of the reason why you really haven't heard as much about Black Lives Matter this year as you did last year. Because as an organization, they simply are not able to focus their efforts in the same way that they were last year. Does that make sense? Questions? Anybody have questions? Okay. So the second critical point of success, the second thing that makes an interest group successful is funding. Listen, here's the truth of it. You could form an interest group to save fuzzy baby kittens. Everybody and their mom wants to be a part of this interest group. And you ain't got no money, you ain't going to be successful. You will not be able to market. You won't be able to print your t-shirts. You won't be able to have your website. You won't be able to hire people to answer the phones. If you don't have money, you can't be successful in the American political system as an interest group. That's just the truth of it. Now, my argument, and I'll just leave this hanging in the air. I think the number one source of power for an interest group is its ability to tug on your heartstrings, the ability to connect to some moral understanding of your need to just do the right thing. Save the environment, because that's the thing we should be doing. Try and really elicit an emotional reaction. Does this make sense? I mean, obviously, you know, there's the accountants union, and maybe they're not quite as emotional about their issues as others, but in the end, they're hoping to get you to feel like this is something important. The truth is, at least in my perspective, basing my success on the accumulation of money can often run counter to the message I'm trying to get out there. Does that make sense? Okay, let me put it a different way. Black Lives Matter tried to make significant amount of money by merchandising, t-shirts, flags, posters, bumper stickers, everybody in there. I mean, the only group that's kind of been inundated by marketing worse in the last year or so seems to be the gay community, and everything's rainbow. Like, I even have several of my gay friends are like, all right, enough of the damn rainbows already. It's actually really funny to see them put memes and stuff out on Facebook where they're making fun of the commercialization of pride. Is this ringing true? Anybody understand what I'm talking about? So what's fascinating to me is whether it's pride or Black Lives Matter, the moment you begin to commercialize the message, there are significant members of the group who no longer believe it's the right message. And so ironically, if you want to be successful, you need to accumulate money, but the way you accumulate money can actually negatively impact the message. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Finally, the third thing you have to have are members. Okay, and if you want to understand the practical impact of this, it's why every silly ass Facebook group begs you to hit like, begs you to sign up.
Oh yeah.
Am I in trouble? She just heard me curse, didn't she? I'm in trouble, Selena.
She's not paying attention.
Oh,
She's not
okay.
paying
I thought she was talking to me.
attention.
Oh man. For the record, I found out. I'm telling you, there's something about profanity and being a New Yorker. I don't even
Did
know.
you hear that?
It's
You
like
did hear that?
dropped an
Oh, you
F-bomb in a
did.
meeting this week, and it took me a minute to realize that everybody was really
I
kind of
really
like, what did he
did.
just say? I'm like, oops. Anyway, the membership is a key component to the success of the interest group. If you don't have members, if you don't have individuals who are supporting the effort directly, it's just me in my basement with a computer trying to make everybody care about what I'm saying. That's it. You got to have memberships. She's adorable. You got to have people that are willing to get involved. Okay. And so what's interesting about the membership component, and I want to get into this. That didn't work out the way I wanted it to. All right. So what if I told you that not everybody that should be in a group or could be in a group is actually in the group? And that the difference between what we want to call the potential group and the actual group is really important to the effectiveness of the organization. So let me give you an example. The potential number of people that are pro Second Amendment and could be members of the NRA is very large. The number of that group that actually are members of the NRA is actually pretty big. The number of pro-gun rights individuals in America who support the NRA is pretty good relative to the number of people that could support the organization, that could be a part of it. Let's say 60%. Does this make sense? To put this differently, there are one of the lowest groups, like groupings, types of groups, in terms of the number of people that could be part of that group versus the number of people that actually are part of that group, join and work. Wait for it. Women's groups. Do you understand what I'm saying? You've got a women's rights organization in New York. There are 14 million women in New York. The organization has 10,000 members. Very small portion of the number of people that could be part of that group. Why is that important? Because then what you get is a small group of people who now are the tip of the sword. They're the ones that are fighting for this huge group, even if the huge group actually isn't involved. Does that make sense? Let me take women out and put Black Lives Matter back in. The number of African Americans or minorities in general who actually go to the protests, work with the website, donate, might be 1%, might be 2%. The organization is now representing an issue that they believe the entire group should be involved in. And when you get a really big difference between the actual group and the potential group, you can limit the effectiveness of the organization. Is this making sense?
With that example, yeah, I get it.
It's really important because here, okay, one of the strengths of the NRA is so many gun owners and pro Second Amendment people are actually involved or at least promote or even members of the NRA. So when other groups look at the NRA and talk about gun rights, they can't claim that that organization isn't representing gun owners. Well, clearly it is. A large number of gun owners support it or their members. There have been people who have absolutely questioned whether or not Black Lives Matter actually represents all African Americans, whether or not the National Women's Organization actually represents the majority of opinions of most women. Does that make sense? And that questioning can in turn affect. Now, what's interesting is depending on the topic, certain people won't care. So if you talk, here's the truth of it, environmental organization in America, every American is a potential member. But the reality is most of those organizations have like 100 people and they just go out on the weekend and they pick up plastic on the beaches and that's what they do. We all benefit. It's called the collective good. We all benefit from what these organizations are doing without having to be a member. Is everybody following me? If you benefit, get this in your notes. If you benefit from a collective good, something an interest group is doing, I think of the environment. The environment is the absolute best example of a collective good, something we all benefit from. All collective good benefit. If you benefit by getting a collective good without actually working towards that good, I don't recycle, I don't pick up trash, I don't do anything. This organization goes along the side of the highway and they do it for me. I'm called a free rider. Anyone who benefits from a collective good without contributing to that good is called a free rider. They are getting stuff for free. They are getting the benefits of what that organization is doing without contributing to the organization's efforts. So again, every American is benefiting from the work of these small environmental groups. Every African American has benefited from the work of the Black Lives Matter movement, whether they've been a part of it or not. Same for women. The National Women's Organization has helped advance women's rights in this country for every woman, regardless of whether or not you joined. Hell, you don't even have to know they exist, and you'll get the benefit. Is everybody with me? Here's the number one problem, whether we are talking race, gender issues, the environment, labor laws, every special interest. If I know I'm going to get that good, no matter what I do, I am going to benefit from cleaner water, whether or not I'm actually taking the garbage out of the river. There's less incentive for me to be involved. You're all following me here?
Yeah.
So we all tend to rely on these groups to fight the good fight for us, even if we're not going to be there. Yeah, I gotta work on Thanksgiving. I'm just not going to be there. You know what? Let me throw $10 towards the local food kitchen because I know they're going to take it. Hell, you know what? I'm not even going to throw $10. I just know they're going to have the food kitchen whether or not I give them money. They'll figure it out. We all do that. The ASPCA commercials with the little shivering dog in the winter. Damn, I hate those commercials, right? And the sappy ass song in the background. Oh, save the right. We all know that. Okay, it's a real thing in all of our societies. Forgive me, I'm not calling anybody out. I'll just use myself. I have never donated to the ASPCA. I have never. The commercial doesn't make me pull out my wallet. Here's the thing. I know that they're still going to keep saving those animals. Whether or not I get involved, I know someone else is going to step up. I'm a free rider. It's not like I hate the puppies. I love the puppies. But my bandwidth is other places. Maybe I have a different special interest that I'm giving my money to. I can free ride on, I forget her name, Sarah McLachlan and her song in the ASPCA. And I can free ride. And I can do that on every issue. If you're a gun owner and you don't send money to the NRA, you are free riding on what the NRA does. You go to the local park, but you don't help on cleanup days, you're free riding on what the local environmental groups have done. That's why they call it the free rider problem. Because we know the people for Black Lives Matter, or for LGBTQ plus community, or for labor union number 203, they're going to get out there and they're going to do their thing, whether or not we're there or not. That's the free rider problem. Because then it affects the power of these different groups, their ability to get money, to influence. So, for instance, the NRA has less of a free rider problem than Greenpeace. That's why the NRA tends to be more politically impactful and have more money, because they have more people who are actually committed and involved in the process. Whereas Greenpeace just hopes somebody sends in some money. Questions so far? Any questions?
What you just said just remind me of when Candice Owen is batching the Black Lives Matter group,
Yep.
and somebody said, well, since you are Black and you have a son, whether you support us or not, your son is still gonna benefit from what we are doing.
Yeah, that's exactly right. But again, so how should I put this? I absolutely rely on the truth that no matter how much I might want to do something on a particular issue, there is always someone with more passion than me who will do it, even if I can't do it at the time. And now for me, right, I have a real passion for the single mother. And I'm not just playing to the crowd, I swear. Hi, honey, how you doing? For me, in the way I was grown up, and frankly, living, growing up in a world where most of the people I saw in stores and stuff were, underdeveloped or just trying to get to middle class. And so the single mom, as I grew up, was kind of the symbol of having to run twice as fast to get half as far relative to other groups in the community. I don't have the capacity to go out and do the things for single moms that I would love to do. But now that I'm in the position I'm in at the school, for instance, you bet your butt that I'm going to bring childcare back to this campus. So I am not involved, for instance, with some of the Jefferson City organizations that help support battered women or single moms. I should be. Full admission, I should be. But I have to focus my efforts in the way in which I think I'm going to be able to affect the issue the most. And so I absolutely am relying on these other people. I'm absolutely free riding on their efforts, knowing that I care a lot about the issue, but as an individual citizen, I only have so much bandwidth. That's a dilemma in understanding where, I mean, is anybody, I don't know if any of you folks like do like church events or work with some of these groups. Anybody that works with some of these groups, I believe the term we're all familiar with is stretched thin. When you're volunteering for these groups, man, they need you all the time, everywhere. You can all of a sudden find yourself volunteering 30 hours a week and you don't even know what happened. That's the nature of these organizations. And so it's a commitment that not everybody makes, even if they want to. Questions so far? All right, guys, why don't we go ahead and take a quick little 5-minute break here before I get into the types, before we start getting into the types. So 5-minute break, I'll be right back. And for the record, I am pausing the recording. Somebody please remind me to, and we are resuming. All right. So again, I always like to break down these topics as much as I can. I know this is probably more than you ever wanted to know about special interest groups, but I think you will find yourself watching the news or kind of hearing about these groups, and now you'll understand them on a much better level, and you'll understand the arguments that go back and forth. So I mean, what's ironic is you know, the people who are part of the pro-gun lobby NRA special interest group hate and dislike and work against the people that are part of the anti-gun lobby and anti-gun special interest groups. And so everyone talks about how unfair interest groups are because they think the other group has more influence, not necessarily because they hate all interest groups. Does that make sense? I'm sorry, I'm indicting American I don't think it's, oh, interest groups are just bad for politics. I think most Americans, if you push them, what it is, they think that the other interest group who they're competing against shouldn't have as much influence. And that's a whole different argument, my opinion. So the 5 types of public interest groups that I want you to remember, and yes, this is one of those slides that I think is just perfect for a test question. You know, which one of the following is not a type of public interest group? Pick 3 of these and then make one up. Okay. So public interest groups, the first type, public interest groups focus on broad public topics or issues. And they have some good examples down there. Education and environment, in my mind, are 2 primary ones. Interest groups. So there are interest groups that are forming, for instance, to fight the changes in voting laws in Georgia. That's what they mean by politics as a public interest area. But again, the goal here is their topic is a topic that affects the entire community or even the entire nation. Okay, it is not a particular group's interest or a specific market or issue. It's that all education. So the second type of interest group would be economic. And these are the interest groups that involve basically business and labor. So when you think economic interest group, think unions. That's probably the absolute best example of an economic interest group. Now, here's one of those areas that people don't always understand, that there are a significant number of very powerful interest groups. Professional interest groups focus on a specific job area or a specific area of employment. One of the most powerful interest groups in America is the National Doctors Associations. You ever see those things? 9 out of 10 doctors approve, 9 out of 10 dentists approve. It was an organization like the National Doctors Association, National Medical Association. They survey all their doctors, and then they put that out to the groups or to the political representatives in particular who need that information to support their public approach to policy. And so professional groups, is anybody familiar with the Bar Association? Right? It's the group that you can't be a lawyer without, right? For lawyers, you cannot be a lawyer without being a member of the Bar Association. The Bar Association is not a federal organization. the way in which that they set up the bar, how they give out the certifications, how they, your lawyer's degree. You get the degree from the school, that's all well and good. You got to go to the bar. You've got to get there signing off. And all they are other lawyers who have agreed these are the standards we use. So I mean, it's an extremely powerful organization. And if you want to mess with somebody, go ahead and mess with your local teachers union. Man, they can disrupt all sorts of stuff. Okay, so these organizations are extremely powerful in an economic sense, but they're not economic interest groups because they're going beyond these broad business and labor areas to really focus on a particular profession, right? It's the difference between an education public interest group and the teachers union. Questions so far? All right, fourth type is an ideological interest group. Ideological interest group. Ideological interest groups focus almost exclusively on core political or religious beliefs. That's the important word there, beliefs. Okay, so an organization that's working to limit abortion. That's going to be a different type of group, for instance, than an organization that's trying to get prayer in schools. Because the abortion issue is really a narrow public interest issue. It's something that ultimately is going to affect the entire society. Whereas the promotion of prayer is a much more general it's almost like you can almost think of ideological groups as focusing on culture rather than specific legal or political frameworks. Your ideological groups, it's the difference between the Republican Party and a conservative interest group. The conservative interest group is pushing conservatism, not necessarily the political issues in the party. Does that make sense? The Coalition of Catholic Churches, they're very powerful. That's an ideological interest group. And again, there's a coalition of Jewish synagogues. There's a coalition for Islamic mosques. There's on and on and on. Every religious group has some sort of special interest group that then tries to put their ideological issues into the political mainstream. Excuse me. Finally, you have single issue interest groups. Single issue interest groups, and they, as it suggests, really focus not just on a single issue in terms of like the environment, but a single issue group might be saving the brown pelican. Now you're getting down to a specific issue. One of the examples I would give here that I think it was much bigger organization when I was younger. I don't know how much influence they have now, but has anybody ever heard of Mothers Against Drunk Driving?
MAD, yeah.
Yeah, MAD, that's it. They are a classic example of a single issue group. Literally, mothers, drunk driving. That's it. You know what I mean? And so the focus is so narrow. I would argue that's one of the reasons why they've been so successful, is because they really had a very narrow focus that then brought in a lot of membership that allowed them to then have a lot of money. What does that mean? Now they can go lobby in Washington, D.C. And MAD has actually been one of those organizations that's been directly involved in strengthening drunk driving laws in almost every state in the country. And so these groups can have a definitive impact. It's just how you form, the membership you get, what your issue is, and ultimately how you're able to influence American politics. Any questions on 5 types of interest groups? 5 types. All right.
The professional ones was the bars and stuff, right?
Say that again.
The professional was like the bar lawyers,
association.
right? That was the other example for
Yep,
that, right?
that's the example I would give there.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So this is just another page kind of reiterating, giving you some examples of some of these different groups and just how powerful they can be. And frankly, if there's one of the things that I really want to get over in this first part of the slide is just, I mean, the variety of interest groups in this country is basically the same as the variety of interests and issues that Americans think are important. We're talking thousands, hundreds of thousands of interest groups, and they all try to work to get their particular focus put into the political narrative. So as we break this down, you can kind of think about interest groups in another way, and you could talk about this idea of institutional interests versus membership interests. Okay. And what this is basically is the idea that some interest groups are focused a lot more on the organizational aspect rather than the individual. So let me see if I can go back. There you go. So you see under business and trade, the National Association of Retail Grocers. It's like, wow, could that sound any more boring? Think about how many grocery stores there are in this country. And if you want to be, it's like one of those things when you start a business. Has anybody here ever started a business? Sarah, you have?
Yeah.
One of the first things I'm guessing you did was look for local business associations that might be able to support you.
Yep.
Yep. I mean, that's, and hell, it might not even be an exact match for your business. You're still going to join because you know now they're going to provide you contacts. You're going to go to a conference. So that's an institutional interest group. In other words, they're really focusing on the market or the International Organization of Real Estate Agents. Great example. They're not trying to kind of promote the interests of individual real estate people. They're talking about the real estate market. That's different than these kind of membership interest groups that you will join, where it's really about advocating for single individuals. That's one of the foundations of the union. Okay. The union is less concerned with whether or not Walmart is operating well within the markets than they are with how individual workers at Walmart are being treated. Does that make sense? I guess you could kind of think of it as some interest groups are almost bottom up. Black Lives Matter is clearly a bottom up. We are looking at individual members of the group and we're creating an infrastructure that's going to support those members. NRA, same thing. Membership interest, we're going to build it up so that ultimately membership interest is what driving what we're doing. But like the Associated Milk Producers, there's a good one. They're not concerned about each individual cow, each individual milk producer. They want to make sure milk is being supported within the market by price subsidies and things like that. So they're a top down. They're more of a, what is the market? What are the issues for everybody? Now let's create a dynamic that'll support those and dribble them down to the individual farmers. Questions so far? I know, not our sexiest topic, but you know, when you're dealing with American politics, man, sometimes it's sausage and sometimes it's steak. Sometimes it's really fascinating stuff, and sometimes you just got to get through the bureaucracy to understand why the other stuff's fascinating. The single most boring class I took in 25 years of education was a class on what's called state compacts. Does anybody know what a state compact is? Did you know the federal government cannot force states to make legal agreements? States have the right to negotiate their own legal agreements with other states. It's called a state compact. So, for instance, I don't know if anybody's following the stuff that's going on out in the West right now, but the Lake Mead, which is the lake that feeds the Hoover Dam, and the Hoover Dam actually provides about 30% of electricity for all of Southwest United States. Lake Mead is 80 something feet below its normal. They're saying that it could be the first time in American history that Lake Mead doesn't have enough water to run the Hoover Dam at full capacity. So the states that actually share that water now have to get together and make deals about how they're going to split that water use. The federal government doesn't do that. The states do that on their own. They literally negotiate like they're separate countries. And my one professor happened to be quite literally the only specialist in the entire country on state compacts. Like anytime any states were about to go into negotiations, they'd fly this guy out. Let me tell you, he was as boring as the topic. I don't know if you've ever been in a class where you can literally feel yourself willing your eyes to stay open. That was this class for me. Like, you're like staring up and you're doing like, oh my God. Yeah. So Trust me when I tell you, I know some of this stuff isn't as interesting as some of this stuff. So, oh man, I didn't even see Courtney was there. But it's got to kind of be known. You got to kind of know what's going on in order to really understand how the big pieces fit together with the little ones. So somebody brought up lobbying, and that is by far the single most important thing that interest groups do in America. Again, lobbying is the single most important activity that interest groups engage in American politics. It is the most direct way that they can influence and affect political decisions. So again, just one more time, lobbying is the most important thing that interest groups do. And that is because it is the most direct way that interest groups can affect political policies and decisions. So what is lobbying? Lobbying is when you actually go and specifically talk to political representatives. So it might be a party, it might be an individual politician, it might be some sort of political group, but you specifically go to them and tell them to vote in favor of your issue. More directly, vote in favor of your perspective on the issue. And there are different ways that you lobby. Okay, so the first type of lobbying is called inside lobbying. This is the one that people hate the most. Inside lobbying is when the NRA sends me to Nancy Pelosi's office to talk specifically to her about that gun bill coming up. The reason why people hate inside lobbying the most is because that's the one that seems like the backdoor deal. That's the one that seems like four guys in a back room are making the decision for everybody else in the country. And just because the NRA has more money than the anti-gun people, they get in those doors more. And so the argument is lobbying really gives a preference, really gives an advantage to the larger groups who have more money. I'll say it again. The reason why many people hate inside lobbying is because the more money you have, the more successful you can be in directly influencing politicians and decision makers. That, I hope you can understand, is going to make all the other groups who didn't get into Nancy Pelosi's office jealous and angry over the system. And more importantly, it's going to make the members and supporters of those other groups angry and bitter. Questions so far? All right. The second type of lobbying is called outside lobbying. Okay. And if it's just to make sure you bring, to kind of give yourself a way to remember this stuff. When you hear inside lobbying, think inside the Capitol. You are inside the Capitol building. You are going to specific politicians' offices. When you hear outside lobbying, you are outside the Capitol building. You are much more focused on the public. It's much more about messaging. It's about awareness. It's about organization. It's about finding other organizations that you can cooperate with. Essentially, it's about every way of influencing the political process without actually talking to the politicians. Does that make sense? You could think of inside lobbying as top down. I'm going to talk to the politician, change his mind or her mind, and then that's going to filter down through all these other layers of government. Outside lobbying is very much bottom up. I'm going to get the people involved. I'm going to rise up. I'm going to influence ultimately the decision makers at the top of the pyramid. So as much as both the NRA and Black Lives Matter represent that member-driven interest group, the primary focus of Black Lives Matter is outside lobbying. The primary focus of the NRA is inside lobbying. So even if you're the same type of organization, it may depending on what your issue is and what your power is and what your source, your membership, your money, outside lobbying and inside lobbying might be different in terms of how valuable it is to what you're trying to accomplish. Questions? Any questions? So there's one third kind of component, and it's less about lobbying and more about a general thing that these interest groups do. And most interest groups on one level or another, one of their goals is to monitor government programs. They're the watchdogs. All right. Anybody ever hear of the Consumer Protection Bureau? Yeah, their whole goal is just to monitor how the government runs consumer markets in the United States. And here's the key. When interest groups are monitoring government programs, their primary focus is simply to determine whether or not those programs are effective. So for instance, that's why you'll see interest groups often focus on things like corruption when they're looking at government operations, because in the end, they believe that they're the only group that's really watching them, the watchdog. Questions? Any questions so far? All righty, moving right along. So now the last kind of component of this discussion. I really like to make you guys think from a theoretical perspective. And I know that it makes some people's head hurt, including my wife. She hates when I get all into the theory, but to me, it's not just enough to know what's going on. I like to have some idea of why it's happening. Why do we have interest groups? And there are three different theories of interest groups that you will see begin to influence why and how we think of them, whether or not we think they're positive or negative, whether or not we think they're important to American politics or weakness of American politics. So the pluralist theory of interest groups is based upon this concept of competition. The pluralist theory argues all societies are made up of groups of citizens. We all tend to group together, women, minorities, Native Americans, the handicapped, young kids. We all tend to group together in these similar groups within a society. We all have our own preferences. So pluralist theory argues interest groups are good for politics because they allow these individual groups to express themselves, wait for it, non-violently within a political system. So let me summarize. Pluralist theory sees interest groups as a positive for politics. They are a positive for politics because they allow individual groups to express themselves within the system without having to turn to violence. So you can argue that the government sucks, you can organize a protest, you can show up in DC, but you don't necessarily have to storm the Capitol building. Sorry, I couldn't go there. I couldn't help it. I had to go there. The key here is, from an American perspective in particular, in pluralism, the idea of different groups being able to express themselves peacefully within politics, that's the foundation of democracy. If you're scared to express yourself, then we can't talk about freedom, we can't talk about liberty, we can't talk about the Bill of Rights. And so these groups are what allow you to actually engage those rights. Your First Amendment freedom of speech, freedom of religion rights, your Second Amendment rights. If we didn't have these interest groups, any number of groups would then find their rights being trampled on. Does this make sense? Again, pluralism, positive. Interest groups are positive. Why? Because they allow for peaceful competition between groups within a society. Questions on pluralist theory. And again, think of it right in a word. The heart of the word is plural, many. The whole idea is the more people that are talking, the more people that are involved, the better off the system is. The second argument or second theory of interest groups is not so nice. Elite theory argues that interest groups are actually formed along class lines. Not only are there classes of interest groups? Poor, middle class, upper class. The nature of interest groups in society is that upper class interest groups tend to have more power. In other words, interest groups for the elite theorist are not good because they actually reinforce inequality in societies. The people with power can form an interest group that then reinforces their power within the system. That doesn't mean the other groups don't form interest groups. But if anyone here thinks that your local grocer and their union has more power than the Walmart and the union they belong to, the interest group they belong to, you're missing the boat. These large business interest groups, here, I mean, to put it in a direct example, all these different groups that might be against gun violence or assault weapons or all these different interest groups, together, they don't have as much power as the NRA. And so from the elite theory, the argument would be interest groups aren't good for American politics because they allow certain elite groups to dominate politics. Does this make sense? So if you're a pluralist and you're looking at lobbying, you're saying, well, you know, yeah, I can see where it might be a little bit of a source of corruption, but the reality is we need lobbying because it allows all the groups to try and influence the government. The elites come back and go, yeah, that sounds real pretty, but the reality is it's a small group of interest groups that have the predominant amount of power and ability to influence. So as much as the theory sounds great, the reality is that interest groups reinforce these inequalities. To put this another way, the people that want to end lobbying tend to be elite theorists, tend to believe that lobbying is actually the source of elite dominance rather than public access. Questions? All right, so here's the third argument. And you can kind of, this will make sense once I lay it out there. Hyperpluralism, okay? So pluralism, the pluralist theory, many. Hyperpluralism, think of it as too many. That's the best way to think of hyperpluralism. So yeah, there's many, but you know what? There's too many. And here's the argument. Interest groups are a sign of weak government. If the government was formed in the proper way to protect and promote everybody's interests equally, you wouldn't need interest groups. The existence of interest groups in a society indicates that there are too many people who feel like the government or the society is not helping them. So they now have to take it into their own hands. Do you see how they're kind of turning the pluralist argument on its head? Any questions? There's no way I'm explaining 3 theories of interest groups that clearly. It's freaking too early in the morning. You got to have questions.
When you say many, too many.
Too many for the hyper TOO many? Like there's too
Right.
many. There's too many interests. There's too many opinions.
Oh, okay. Okay.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So yeah, they look at that, you know, it's like it's the person that walks into a baseball stadium and sees everybody there and they go, oh wow, it's awesome that all these people have come together to enjoy the Yankees beating up the Boston Red Sox. That would be the pluralist approach. Look at all these people, isn't this great? The hyper pluralist would walk into that and go, oh my God, look at all these people. I'm not gonna hang out here. COVID or, you know, too many people. That's the approach to interest groups. The idea that there are simply too many of these individual promotions. Okay, I'll put it as blunt as I can. There are too many people whose personal interests and opinions are being elevated over the interests of the nation. Does that sound familiar? That's the hyperpluralist perspective. Your opinion should not be more important than what it means to be American. Stop starting all these damn little interest groups to promote your interests above everybody else's. Does that sound familiar? Questions?
You said elite theory reinforces imbalance of what again? Can you rephrase that
Inequality.
again?
It reinforces inequality
Oh,
because
inequality.
the people who form interest groups to protect what they have, right, have more power than the people that end up forming interest groups to try and elevate what they have. So from the elite, you can think of it, what if I put it this way? Pluralists tend to be liberals. Elites tend to be more socialists or progressives. And hyper-pluralists tend to be more conservative, if that helps. I'm not making it automatic. It's not a one-to-one. You can be conservative and be a pluralist, okay? But general tendencies in American politics, if you're conservative, you're going to tend to think that there are too many damn personal interests and that we've lost sight of what America should be, right? If you're an elite theorist, you're going to talk about, you know, it's just the damn 1% really taking advantage of the rest of America just to accumulate wealth and power. That's what it's all about. And if you're the pluralist, you're going to kind of say, hey, listen, the more the merrier. And it's not always going to be perfect, but we have to have a system where everybody has the opportunity to produce or to input. Did that help a little bit, Selena, in terms of?
Yeah, that makes complete
Okay.
sense. Thank you.
Questions? Okay, so these next slides, all I'm doing is really breaking down the overview that I just gave you, the idea of, you know, what are the difference between the pluralist arguments and the hyperpluralism or even elite arguments. And again, you know, these are all negatives. These are all arguments against the interest group. Okay, first and foremost, the interest groups work more. I mean, I already showed you, if you have more money in your interest group, you're going to be more successful. So by definition, the wealthy have more value in the interest group. It promotes the advancement of interests that don't always strive for the common good. There's one for you. There's a big one for you. I would argue that second one there is at the heart of the gun lobby, anti-gun debate in America. The argument of whether or not which group is actually promoting the common good. The NRA absolutely argues that they are promoting the common good through protection of the Second Amendment. Anti-gun lobby absolutely argues, no, we're promoting the common good because there should be a ban on assault weapons. So that's an issue for the idea of the interest group, is how do we fit that into the concept of the common good? Large corporations absolutely dominate the system. Sorry, you can put a little star next to that one. There's just no other way to put it. You might not want to subscribe to the elite perspective completely, you know, and get kind of drilled down into the whole elite, almost, you know, critical theory kind of perspectives. But I'm pretty sure, I don't care what category you fall in, most people understand that large corporations dominate lobbying in particular. And I'm sorry, did somebody say something?
Did you say to put a star by that third one?
Yeah, I think that's a really important one because, okay, so for instance, when you hear about lobbying corruption in relation to American politicians, it's almost always in relation to something that they were offered or given by a large corporation. Right? And I mean, it's just, it's funny the way they do it. So I can't give Sarah $100,000 to push my law through. Okay.
But you can bribe her.
Oh no, I can't do that either. Any of that stuff is
Or donate.
automatically illegal. As a business, I can huge fines, and as a politician, you can not only lose your job but be thrown in jail. So I can't bribe you. I can't just give you the money. But how do I use that money to influence you? This is what I do. I invite you to my annual conference that I just happen to hold in Acapulco every year. I fly you down. I pay for your room. I'm not bribing you. I need you to come to the conference to hear what I have to say about soybeans. Why shouldn't I just make sure that it is the best vacation you've ever had in your life? Hell, even if you don't like soybeans, you're going to remember that trip to Acapulco. And it's much harder for anyone to argue that I bribed you because I had a conference schedule, I had speakers, and of course you're going to fly the person there if you're inviting the. So there's all sorts of ways, all sorts of ways. Here's a big one. The leaders of these groups are not elected. So there's no accountability to the membership. I go back to the Black Lives Matter here. One of the issues is some leaders of Black Lives Matter were, at least have been called out for what people have argued is misuse of funds. I guess one of the leaders apparently bought a house, and the question is whether or not she used funds from the Black Lives Matter group to buy the house. And that's just one of the many things that ultimately comes down to, for the record, the NRA just had a significant issue with its leadership. Okay, so every organization, leadership, because it's not elected, means that they operate kind of in their own world, and that can cause a lot of problems. Cleopatra.
So did I hear you say these theories are all kind of negative?
Yeah, all those things are negative. All these are potential arguments for why we could get rid of interest groups, or why interest groups potentially negatively impact American politics.
But what the is it a pluralist theory? I was thinking they were kind of more
Hyperpluralism.
they like the idea. Yeah.
Yes, yes. It's just, so I don't want you to necessarily think of pluralism and hyperpluralism as an either or. It's more of a spectrum. And as you move along it, you more and more question the role of interest groups. So I say this, you can be a part of something, think the something is really good, and still think the part isn't right. So there are lobbyists, people who work for these interest groups in Washington, D.C., who think we could fix the lobbying system. Okay, they're part of it, and they still think. So again, it's a spectrum. And so the more of these things that you would say, yeah, that's something that makes interest groups bad, the more you're going to move towards that hyperpluralist position. Does that make sense, Cleopatra?
Yes, sir.
All right. So interest group bias. Interest group bias. Every interest group is biased. It is baked into the very concept of the interest group. Now, on the inside, that's extremely powerful. When me and Crystal and Sarah get together to save that brown pelican, that's the only thing we're focused on in that room. That's our bias. We all share that bias. We're going to get it done. But it's important to understand that outside that room, that bias can be a real problem. Right? And so there are people who have argued that Black Lives Matter absolutely needs to focus on the relationship between the African American male and the police to fix that relationship, as much as it's been kind of symbolized by racism and discrimination for decades, if not centuries. That said, there are other groups who argue that the bias of Black Lives Matter is impacting the ability of other groups to affect legal change or affect law enforcement improvement. Is this making sense? Bias can be a very good thing for the group inside, and it can really be a negative for the group outside, depending on how it affects the perception of people who aren't part of that group. Does this make sense? Questions? And obviously money can really affect this concept of bias, you know, and whether or not you choose to support a group or not, whether or not you choose to support the principle and the position of that group or not, that the way in which they flame it. I think, okay, here's a good example. Compare how the NAACP and Black Lives Matter present their positions versus how they're perceived by groups outside of them. And then how that affects their ability to actually get practical change relative to the position that they're presenting. Does that make sense? I mean, I would argue that PETA is seen as one of the more aggressive animal rights groups. They're doing the same thing as your local ASPCA, but they're biased towards a more aggressive approach to the issue then makes other people think that group's more biased, that group's more this, and it affects how they then interact with that group. Questions on interest group bias. Interest group bias, just how focused you are on your issue, just how much you elevate that issue above others. That's an issue for interest groups. Questions? Any questions? All right.
Repeat that last sentence real quick, one more time.
The bias affects not just what the group does, but the perceptions of what the group does. It is a value within the group because it brings the members together, but it can be a negative outside the group because people often reflect negatively to bias. Does that make sense? Like, we all have that friend that no matter what else is going on, they have to talk about their favorite sports team, or they have to talk about that fishing trip, or it's like everything they do is about that damn fishing boat. That bias towards that issue begins to affect how other people see that person and the issue, even if they like fishing. Does that make sense? That affects whole groups. That affects whole groups. If all you're talking about is your one particular focus on the damn brown pelican, well, unless I want to talk about the brown pelican, I'm probably not going to invite you to every meeting I have. That bias tends to impact the actual effectiveness of my group. Did that help explain a little bit? All right. So this crazy looking diagram, once I explain it to you, will actually, I think, help really give you a visual of what I'm talking about. So put it another way, this is literally the entire lecture in one picture. Okay. What I'm trying to explain here is how the lobbying process works, how these groups actually affect things. So you want to start with the green circle in the lower right corner, the interest group. And for our example, we're focusing on tobacco. If you're not aware, one of the groups that perhaps is even more powerful than the NRA is the tobacco industry. Their lobbying, it is the tobacco industry is the reason why there were not warnings on cigarette packs until the 1990s, because they lobbied successfully for 30 years to make sure you did not put anything on a pack of cigarettes. Okay, so that's just one example. I mean, another one, I don't know if you guys are aware, but there's currently a bill that's being discussed that would make it, that would outlaw flavored tobacco products, including vaping and all of that, right?
Yeah.
And part of the argument is that throwing flavors into it makes it more attractive to kids and young people. And so that actually by having the flavored tobacco products, you're actually promoting smoking rather than trying to limit it. Okay. Not for nothing, folks, that argument's been around for about 40 years. To put this in perspective.
I've heard many times that, they're going to get rid of menthol cigarettes.
Yep.
And
Yep. It's going to be just straight. And again, if you want to understand this, when I was growing up, one of the more popular candies were candy cigarettes. They came in a little fake pack, 20 of little sugar sticks that would have you zooming around the room. But yeah, it looked just like a pack of Lucky Strikes. So it was the interest groups, the tobacco lobby that would tell, no, this is and they would continue to lobby, and they would give money, and they would donate, and they would help out. And so it took a long time, right? And how do they do that? Campaign contributions in support of individuals, constantly putting out information. So they were the ones, for instance, they would spend millions of dollars to study the impact of tobacco on different groups. And so ironically, one of the things that ultimately broke the back of the tobacco lobby is in the 1960s, they commissioned a study to try and prove that cigarettes weren't bad for you. The internal study actually proved that they were killing people, cancer, the whole nine. Their own study proved how bad cigarettes were for people. They buried it. And it was only through interest groups, anti-tobacco, and the use of, and I don't know if you're aware of this, the Freedom of Information Act. Any American can request, doesn't mean you're going to get it, but any American can request any federal document from any organization that has ever been written. called the Freedom of Information Act. And the Freedom of Information Act allowed the interest groups to get that. And once it came out that the tobacco industry had known for 30 years that Americans were dying from cancer from cigarettes, the tobacco lobby lost the whole thing. And all of a sudden there were the signs on the packages. There were limits on how much of the chemicals you could have in each. There were testing of cigarettes. I don't know if you guys know, it used to be real popular to have the larger size cigarette, the 120s. I don't know if anybody's a smoker or used to smoke or whatever. One of the things that this whole sea change did was limit the size of the cigarette. So it really had an impact. But at the time, okay, it was about interest groups influencing politicians through contributions support, also getting out there. Remember that outside lobbying. So you would see commercials where it was just some woman like leaning back next to the pool, smoking a cigarette. Like, man, life doesn't get any better than this. It had nothing to do with a particular brand. They were just trying to convince you that smoking cigarettes were cool. That was the marketing. So after all that influence begins to coalesce and create momentum, then Congress has to actually start making laws. And so that's the influence there. How does that brown circle get affected by what the interest groups are doing? How does Congress, how do all the things change? And the changes are through budgets, laws, ultimately the way in which Congress affects the tobacco industry. Everything from the producers to the sellers to, okay, now you can't put cigarettes right on the counter. They have to be on the wall behind you. Little changes like that. You cannot have cigarette ads at any public venue. Again, people don't understand. Back in the day, one of the largest signs at Yankee Stadium was the Marlboro Man sign. Okay, all of that stuff goes away, and it's all happening, whether it was the tobacco industry dominating American culture or the reversal and the tobacco industry being highly regulated. It's all part of this interaction of these three groups: the bureaucracy that implements and enforces laws, the interest groups that want them changed based upon their particular perspectives on a topic, and the political systems that make all the laws in the first place. This is the relationship. Questions on lobbying, on interest groups? Well, folks, that is, as they say, all I got. I hope I didn't bore you to tears. I see probably the little kids were probably the smartest ones because I don't see any of them in the Zoom panels anymore. So they all ran from this boring ass conversation. So that's probably in their best benefit. But again, honestly, to me, am I asking you to remember every detail about interest groups that I just talked about for 2 hours? Obviously not. In my mind, what would be interesting is you start to see the little influences in your own communities and your own daily lives that interest groups have. Literally right down to changes in handicap signs. The idea that, I don't know if, so now I want to say it was 2000s. You can't go to an ATM now without having Braille right next to the number. That was from an interest group. That was the Blind Citizens Association who forced that change, lobbying to Congress. Congress forces the people that make the machines to change how they make the buttons. And then that's interest group activity. It really impacts everything we do. So as boring as it might be, the reality is I would argue interest groups might be one of the most important parts of the American political system today. And with that, folks, as always, it's a pleasure. I really do enjoy working with you guys. We are at the end of week 5. I will be going through and finalizing grades on the papers. And just as a reminder, I am going to put as much red ink as I can on these papers, whether it's an A or an F. The point is that I want to give you significant points to consider when you then go and develop the final draft. So if you're a great writer and you did good sources, and I'm going to go in and I need to be clear, I'm going to push you even further. Hey, could you use a better resource? How about some data? How about some I'm really going to get you, try and push you further. Go ahead, Sarah.
Just regarding the quiz that's due on Sunday,
Yep.
are we gonna go over Congress or have we already done that? I'm trying to,
No, we did the presidency, right? Now is my kind of mess up with the PowerPoints and stuff. So
right,
we
yeah.
should have done this last week. Today should have been the presidency. We'll be
Okay,
back
so
on track with tomorrow and we'll do Congress.
Okay, so this is basically just the final recap for the midterm, right?
Exactly.
So do we
Selena?
have a quiz and a mid, oh, sorry.
Yep, yes, technically speaking, the quiz and the midterm are both due this Sunday. But the quiz, again, is just going to be on that lecture material. And I hope for most of you that you've been now studying for the midterm for a couple of weeks. And so all I'm trying to do, and just to be clear, there might be max 3 questions on public interest groups. I'm thinking there's probably only 1 or 2. But even that 1 or 2, I just felt like it wouldn't be fair unless I had this lecture before you guys did that. So that's why I did it this way. Again, my apologies for confusion, and I appreciate your patience. Selena, go ahead.
I have 2 questions. So the quiz this week is on which chapter again?
The quiz for this week is focusing on the presidency. And you'll forgive me, but I can't remember the exact chapter at the moment. I'd have to pull up the website. But you should be focusing on the presidency and then Congress. Those are the 2 primary components of today.
Chapter 12 and 13.
Thank you. I was just getting there. Chapters 12 and 13. So that's for the quiz. And again, the quiz is no different than any other quizzes. And you know what? Give me 1 second. Give me 1 second. I'm just going to, I want to make sure, because I don't really have a summary slide for the, where am I? Holy cow, I've got about 10 times more stuff on my screen than I used to when I was just a teacher. There we are. And going into the quiz, week 5, the president and Congress. Okay. So if everybody's listening, quiz for this week. You want to know the terms of office for elected officials. And again, this is going to be the Congress discussion. All right. So relative to what we already went through, you want to know, okay, I have a question, specific question on the Trump's America article. I have a specific question on the Congress has a job article. You want to know about the presidential power of the veto. And the rest of it we'll go over basically in the discussion tomorrow with Congress. Now, going to the midterm. Sorry, give me 1 second. I'm looking through right now. For the midterm and the special interest component, you want to understand that collective action issue, the idea of the free rider, right? The idea of one of the weaknesses, if you will, of the special interest group. But relative to the broader discussion of interest groups, you probably don't need to have a deep handle of much more than that. So if you're just studying the interest group component, my suggestion would be to make sure you really understand that collective goods, collective action problems component of the discussion. And I can't in good conscience give you any more of the exam than that. Any questions, issues, thoughts, ideas, final comments?
You want to say collective action problem that was
The free rider thing, when I
Okay, the free
discussed
rider
the
thing,
free
okay.
rider. Yep. There's some other, I think the textbook will bring up some other collective action problems. It wouldn't hurt to know that broader discussion. But the primary issue that I definitely want you to be able to talk about, because you will, I promise you, now that you've heard and understand the concept of the free rider, you are going to be shocked at how many members of American society are free riders and just how many topics they free ride on. Does that make any sense? We all free ride. We all take advantage. I understand, Crystal. You have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow. I just think the free rider concept is one of those things in America. I often say to my students that the single most underappreciated yet most important right of Americans, more important than freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the most important right, the right to do nothing. The right to do nothing is the hallmark of freedom of liberty in this country. Why does that matter? Because the right to do nothing, I don't even have to vote if I don't want to. I don't have to work. I don't have to go to school. There are no laws that force me to do anything. And yet I will get the benefits as an American of everything that everyone else is doing. That's free riding. And that's the collective action problem. How do I get us all to cooperate when I know Selena's still going to go pick up trash even if I don't show up? What's the incentive to show up? That's the problem. Anything else, guys?
This is in reference to the midterm party platform. Where would I find that in the chapter? Because I was trying to figure where that was at. This is the only one of the only concepts.
Party
I had a hard time
platform. There's
finding.
definitely a section of that chapter that talks about the party platform, but it's also in the PowerPoint. And hold on a second. I'd really, can you shoot that to me in an email? Because I'm going to have to, if I'm going to answer that, I don't remember the exact part where it is in there. I know we talked about it in the slides, and I also know it's in the chapter, but I just can't remember the exact page or section. So I'd have to look that up.
Okay.
That said, that's one of the things. No party platform. That's not wasted research or studying, I should say. Okay.
Thank you so
Folks.
much, Dr. Watson.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
No, it was my pleasure. You guys have a great day. Are you at work, dear? Getting ready for work?
Yeah, I'm at work. I have no AC at my house.
Oh man.
Yeah.
Wow.
So-
You know what's funny is it took me 3 seconds to realize that you're at a restaurant.
I work at a bar out in Dixon, 28 Shots. So I came in before we opened, and
I
so I'm
worked
not
in
sitting
restaurants
in my-
for 25 years. I'm having like flashbacks right now as I watch her walk by getting everything together. I gotta go, man. Guys, have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow morning.
Thank you. See you tomorrow.